Sometimes, the smallest act of disrespect reveals the biggest mistake a person will ever make. The afternoon sun hung heavy over the quiet street, the kind of heat that made the air feel thicker, slower, pressing down on everything it touched as cars rolled by in a steady rhythm, and people moved with that familiar summer fatigue, eyes half-focused, minds elsewhere, until a sudden splash broke through the noise, sharp and out of place, like a crack in something that wasn't supposed to break, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause as water dripped slowly from the brim of an old man's hat, running down the lines of his weathered face and soaking into the collar of his faded button-down shirt, the silence around him louder than any shout. While standing just a few feet away, Officer Daniel Brooks lowered an empty plastic bottle with a smirk that didn't quite hide the irritation behind his eyes, his posture stiff with the kind of authority that didn't need to explain itself. Not here. Not to someone like the man in front of him, because in his mind, this was simple, routine. Just another interaction he believed he controlled. Just another person he assumed didn't belong. And yet the man he had just humiliated, Elijah Carter, didn't react the way the crowd expected, didn't raise his voice, didn't argue, didn't even flinch beyond a slow blink as the last drops of water slid down his cheeks, his hands resting calmly at his sides, fingers slightly curled, as if holding on to something invisible but unbreakable, and around them, a small crowd had already begun to form, drawn in by curiosity the way people always are, some standing back with crossed arms, others pulling out their phones, capturing the moment without stepping into it, their whispers low but present, a quiet ripple of judgment and discomfort that filled the space between every breath, because everyone could see what was happening, everyone could feel that something wasn't right. But no one moved, no one spoke loud enough to matter, and that silence became its own kind of weight, pressing down, just as heavily as the heat, while Brooks took a step closer, his boots scraping lightly against the pavement as he tilted his head, studying Elijah like he was trying to prove a point no one had asked for, his voice carrying just enough to reach the edges of the crowd as he muttered something dismissive, something meant to reduce, to belittle, to remind the old man of where he thought he stood. But Elijah didn't respond, not the way Brooks expected. Instead, he slowly lifted his gaze, meeting the officer's eyes with a calm that felt almost out of place in a moment like this, not defiant, not afraid, just steady, like someone who had already seen how this story would unfold long before anyone else realized they were part of it. And for a brief second, something flickered in Brooks' expression, a hesitation so small it could have been imagined, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced again by that same hardened look of control, as if doubling down was easier than questioning himself. And somewhere behind the crowd, a teenager adjusted his phone, zooming in slightly, the lens capturing every detail, every drop of water, every shift in expression, turning a private moment into something permanent, something that would outlive the heat, outlive the street, outlive the assumptions being made in real time. And Elijah, still standing there in the center of it all, finally moved, not in anger, not in protest, but in a quiet, deliberate gesture as he reached up and brushed a line of water from his cheek, his fingers lingering for just a second longer than necessary before lowering back down. And when he spoke, his voice was soft, almost lost beneath the distant hum of traffic, but close enough for those nearest to hear, carrying a weight that didn't match its volume. "It's a hot day," he said, as if stating something obvious, something simple, and yet there was something beneath it, something unspoken that hung in the air like a question no one dared to answer, while Brooks let out a short, dismissive breath, shaking his head as if the moment had already ended for him, as if whatever this was didn't matter beyond the surface. But what he didn't see, what none of them fully understood, yet, was that this moment wasn't ending. It was beginning, unfolding quietly beneath the noise and the silence alike, because somewhere far beyond that street, far beyond the assumptions made in seconds, there was a connection already in motion, a line already drawn between what had just happened and what would happen next. And Elijah, standing there soaked but unshaken, lowered his eyes briefly, not in defeat, but in thought, as if measuring time itself, as if waiting for something inevitable, something that didn't need to be rushed, because some forms of justice don't arrive loudly, they arrive precisely, and when they do, They don't just change a moment, they redefine it. The heat did not fade, and neither did the tension. It settled deeper into the pavement, into the shoulders of the people watching, into the quiet space between breaths where no one quite knew what to do next as Officer Daniel Brooks shifted his weight and glanced around. Not at Elijah, but at the growing number of eyes fixed on him. Phones raised, recording, capturing angles he could not control, and for the first time his confidence had to compete with something else, something less familiar. The awareness of being seen, not just as an officer, but as a man being watched, judged, remembered. And yet he straightened his posture again, adjusting his belt as if that alone could restore the balance he believed he held. While Elijah Carter remained still, water drying slowly under the sun, leaving faint marks across the fabric of his shirt like quiet evidence of a moment no one could pretend did not happen. And somewhere behind the front row of onlookers a woman whispered to someone beside her, her voice low but edged with discomfort, asking if anyone had called someone, if this was even allowed, if this should be happening in broad daylight like it was nothing. But her question dissolved into the same silence that had taken hold of everyone else, because uncertainty has a way of keeping people still, and Brooks, sensing that hesitation, leaned into it, taking half a step closer again, his tone sharper now, less performative and more defensive, as if he needed to reassert control before it slipped too far, asking Elijah where he thought he was going, what he thought he was doing, questions that sounded official but felt empty, because Elijah had not moved, had not resisted, had not done anything that required explanation, and yet the questions came anyway, filling space that did not need to be filled, while Elijah slowly turned his head, not to answer but to look past Brooks for just a second, his gaze drifting toward the street beyond the crowd where traffic continued like nothing unusual had happened, cars passing by, drivers unaware of the moment unfolding just a few feet away. And then he looked back, meeting Brooks again with that same steady calm, the kind that does not challenge but does not submit either, and it unsettled something deeper than anger, something quieter, because it left no room for escalation, no reaction to push against, just a mirror held up to behavior that suddenly seemed louder than intended, and Brooks let out a breath, quick and controlled, before speaking again, this time louder, as if volume alone could reclaim the narrative, telling Elijah to move along, to clear the area, to stop drawing attention, even though it was already too late for that, because attention had arrived the moment the water hit, and it was not leaving anytime soon, and Elijah nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if he understood the words but not the authority behind them. And as he shifted his stance, just slightly, his hand brushed against the edge of his wristwatch, an old piece, worn but polished, catching a brief glint of sunlight that flickered almost unnoticed, except for the subtle way his fingers lingered there, pressing lightly as though marking time, or perhaps signaling something unseen, and the teenager holding the phone adjusted again, zooming closer, capturing that small movement without understanding it. Just another detail in a moment already filled with them, while the air seemed to tighten again, the kind of invisible pressure that builds before something changes, and Brooks glanced once more at the crowd, his jaw setting as he realized this was no longer contained, that whatever this interaction was supposed to be had already expanded beyond him, beyond the street, beyond control, and yet he stayed, rooted in place by a mix of pride and habit, unaware that the moment he was trying to end had already reached further than he could see, because a few blocks away, an engine idled at a red light, a dark vehicle waiting as the signal counted down in silent seconds, and inside it, a man sat with his eyes fixed ahead, his phone resting face down on the console, a notification already received, already understood, and as the light shifted from red to green, the vehicle moved forward with quiet purpose, merging into traffic not with urgency, but with certainty, heading toward a place where something had already begun, and back on the sidewalk, Elijah exhaled slowly, the faintest hint of something changing in his expression, not relief, not fear, but recognition, as if the next part of the story had just stepped into motion, and this time, it would not be silent. The movement of traffic blended into a low, constant hum, but something in the atmosphere had shifted, subtle yet undeniable, like the moment before a storm breaks where the air feels heavier without explanation, and Officer Daniel Brooks felt it even if he could not name it, his eyes scanning the edges of the gathering crowd again, noticing how the whispers had grown quieter, more focused, how the phones were no longer just recording casually, but holding steady, as if people sensed that whatever was happening was not finished yet, and that awareness pressed against him in a way that made standing still feel different than it had just minutes ago. While Elijah Carter adjusted his posture slightly, rolling his shoulders back as the last traces of water dried under the sun, his presence unchanged, grounded, as if the moment had not diminished him but revealed something deeper, something that did not depend on the approval of anyone watching. And for a brief second, his eyes drifted again toward the far end of the street, not searching, not hoping, just acknowledging, as if he knew exactly what direction mattered and when, and Brooks followed that glance instinctively, turning his head just enough to look past Elijah toward the road where a dark SUV had just turned onto the block, its movement smooth and unhurried, blending into traffic with the kind of precision that did not call attention to itself. And yet something about it felt deliberate, like it belonged to a different rhythm than everything else around it. And Brooks narrowed his eyes slightly before dismissing the thought, shifting his focus back to Elijah, as if regaining control required ignoring anything that did not fit the narrative he had built. And his voice came again, sharper now, telling Elijah that this was his final warning, that he needed to leave, that lingering here was only going to make things worse. Words meant to close the moment, to force an ending before anything else could unfold. But Elijah did not move, not immediately. Instead he took a slow breath, the kind that settles rather than escalates. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet steadiness that did not match the tension surrounding them. "You ever wonder," he said softly, his eyes still on Brooks, "how quickly a moment can change?" And the question hung there, simple but weighted, not confrontational, not threatening, just present. And Brooks let out a short, dismissive laugh, shaking his head as if brushing it off, because to him, this was still something he could end, something he could walk away from with the same certainty he had started with. And yet behind him, unnoticed, the SUV had slowed, pulling to the curb with controlled precision, its engine idling quietly as the doors remained closed for just a second longer than expected, as if timing itself mattered, as if the moment needed to align perfectly before the next step revealed itself. And inside, a man sat with his hands resting calmly on his knees, his expression composed but focused, his eyes already locked on the scene ahead through the tinted glass, taking in every detail, every posture, every movement. And without urgency, he reached for the door handle, pausing just briefly as if confirming what he already knew, before stepping out into the sunlight, his presence immediate yet controlled, not loud, not rushed, but unmistakably purposeful. And as his shoes met the pavement, something shifted again in the crowd, a subtle ripple as people instinctively made space without understanding why, their attention drawn not by noise but by presence, by the quiet authority that does not need to announce itself. And Brooks, still facing Elijah, had not yet turned, had not yet seen what was approaching from behind, had not yet realized that the moment he had tried to contain was now expanding beyond anything he could manage, while Elijah's gaze softened just slightly, not in relief but in recognition, as if the timing he had been waiting for had arrived exactly as expected. And for the first time since the water had fallen, there was a change, not in his posture, not in his voice, but in the air around him, a shift that did not come from fear or anger, but from certainty, the kind that does not need to prove itself, because it already knows what comes next. The shift did not arrive with noise, it arrived with presence, the kind that changes a space before a single word is spoken. And as the man from the SUV stepped fully onto the sidewalk, the subtle hum of conversation thinned into near silence, not commanded, not forced, just naturally pulled away by something people could feel but not explain. And he walked forward with measured steps, not hurried, not hesitant, his gaze fixed ahead, taking in the scene with a level of focus that suggested he was not discovering anything new but confirming what he already knew. And as he moved closer, details began to settle into place, the tailored dark suit, the calm precision in his posture, the quiet confidence that did not rely on volume or display. And somewhere within the crowd, someone lowered their phone slightly, their attention shifting from the moment they were recording to the person who had just entered it, sensing that the story had just changed direction. While Officer Daniel Brooks, still facing Elijah Carter, continued speaking, his tone edged with frustration now, repeating his earlier demand with more force as if repetition could restore authority, but his words no longer carried the same weight, not because they had changed, but because the environment around them had, and Elijah, standing steady, did not interrupt, did not respond. Instead, his eyes lifted just past Brooks, locking onto the approaching figure with quiet recognition. And in that instant, something almost imperceptible passed between them, not a signal, not a gesture, just an understanding that needed no explanation, and Brooks caught that shift too late, noticing the change in Elijah's focus, the way his attention moved beyond him, and instinctively, Brooks turned, his body following his gaze as he finally looked over his shoulder, and what he saw did not register all at once, not immediately, because there was nothing dramatic, nothing aggressive, just a man walking forward with calm certainty, closing the distance step by step, and yet that calm carried something heavier than confrontation, something that did not need to prove itself to be recognized, and Brooks straightened slightly, adjusting his stance as if preparing for a new interaction, his expression tightening into something more controlled, more official, but beneath that surface, there was a flicker of uncertainty beginning to form, subtle but real. Because the situation he thought he understood was no longer as clear as it had been moments ago. And the man continued forward until he was just a few feet away, stopping at a distance that felt intentional, neither too close nor too far, and for a brief second, no one spoke, the space holding a silence that felt deliberate, as if even time itself was pausing to observe what would happen next. And then the man's eyes moved from Brooks to Elijah, scanning him not with alarm but with care, taking in the damp shirt, the traces of water, the stillness in his posture, and something in his expression shifted, not into anger, not into outrage, but into something quieter, something deeper, a controlled recognition that did not need to be displayed to be understood. And when his gaze returned to Brooks, it carried a different weight, one that did not raise its voice yet did not leave room for dismissal. And Brooks, for the first time since the moment began, did not speak immediately, did not assert, did not interrupt, because something in that look disrupted the rhythm he had been following, and in that disruption, there was a brief space where control no longer felt automatic, where certainty had to be reconsidered, and the crowd, sensing it, leaned in without moving, their attention sharpened, their silence now intentional rather than uncertain, while Elijah remained exactly where he had been, unchanged, grounded, as if the arrival of this new presence had not altered him, but simply aligned the moment with what it was always meant to become. And the man finally spoke, his voice calm, even, carrying clearly without needing to rise, addressing Brooks not with hostility but with precision, asking a simple question that landed heavier than any accusation. Is there a reason you felt this was necessary? And the words did not demand, did not accuse, they invited explanation. But within that invitation was something undeniable, something that made it clear this was no longer just an interaction on a hot afternoon. This was now something that would be seen, understood, and remembered in a way Brooks had not prepared for. And as the question settled into the air, Brooks opened his mouth to respond. But for the first time, the answer did not come as easily as before. The question did not echo. It settled, heavy and precise, like something placed exactly where it needed to be. And for a brief moment the entire street seemed to hold its breath, not because of the words themselves, but because of the calm way they had been delivered, a calm that did not challenge but did not yield, and Officer Daniel Brooks felt that weight immediately, even before he fully understood why, his posture tightening as he straightened his shoulders, instinctively reaching for the confidence he had carried just minutes earlier, but it did not come back the same way, not as easily, not as naturally, because now there was something else in front of him, something that did not react the way he expected, and that difference created a pause he could not ignore, while the man stood there, unmoving, his eyes steady, waiting, not pressing, not repeating, simply allowing the silence to do what it does best, reveal what is underneath. And Brooks cleared his throat, shifting slightly as he began to respond, his voice measured, more formal now. explaining that he was handling a situation, that the individual had been lingering, that he was maintaining order, the kind of explanation that sounded structured but lacked substance when placed against the reality of what everyone had just seen. And as he spoke, the crowd remained quiet, but their attention sharpened, no longer passive, no longer uncertain, now listening, comparing, weighing every word against the memory still fresh in their minds. And the teenager holding the phone adjusted his grip again, making sure the frame was steady, capturing not just what was being said but how it was being said, the slight hesitation, the recalibration in tone, the shift from control to justification, and the man listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, absorbing each word with a focus that did not rush to respond, as if allowing Brooks to finish was part of something larger, part of a process that did not need to be forced. And when Brooks finished, there was a brief silence again, thinner this time, more fragile, and then the man nodded once, slowly, acknowledging the explanation without confirming it, before speaking again, his voice still calm, still even, but carrying a clarity that cut through the tension without raising its volume. Maintaining order does not require humiliation, he said, each word deliberate, placed carefully, leaving no room for misunderstanding. And Brooks felt that sentence land, not as an attack, but as a correction. A line drawn not with force, but with certainty, and for the first time, the situation was no longer something he could define on his own terms, because now there was another perspective present, one that could not be dismissed as easily as the others in the crowd. And Brooks shifted again, glancing briefly around as if searching for support, but the faces he saw offered none, only observation, only quiet judgment, and that absence spoke louder than any confrontation could have, while Elijah Carter remained still, his presence unchanged, watching not with satisfaction, not with anticipation, but with a quiet patience that suggested he had seen moments like this before, understood them in ways that did not need to be explained. And the man's gaze moved briefly back to Elijah, softer this time, acknowledging him without words, before returning to Brooks. And in that movement, something became clearer, not announced, not declared, but felt. A connection that shifted the balance of the moment without needing to be spoken aloud, and Brooks sensed it, even if he could not fully define it yet. His earlier certainty now replaced with a growing awareness that this interaction was no longer contained within his authority, that it had extended beyond his reach in ways he had not anticipated, and the man took a small step closer, not aggressive, not invasive, just enough to narrow the space between them. And from the inside pocket of his jacket, he reached slowly, deliberately, pulling out a badge that caught the sunlight just enough to reflect a sharp glint across the scene. And he held it up at chest level, not thrust forward, not waved, simply presented, allowing Brooks to see it clearly, to read it, to understand it without explanation. And in that instant, everything shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, because the authority Brooks had relied on was no longer the highest authority in the space. And as his eyes moved over the badge, recognition settled in, followed quickly by something else, something quieter but more powerful, the realization that the moment he thought he controlled had already moved beyond him. And the man lowered the badge just slightly, his voice unchanged as he spoke again. "Marcus Carter," he said, not as an introduction seeking acknowledgement, but as a statement of fact. And the name hung there, steady, grounded, carrying with it a weight that did not need to be explained, because for those who understood, it was already enough. And for Brooks, standing there in the heat that suddenly felt heavier than before, it was the beginning of something he could no longer stop. The name did not need explanation. It carried its own gravity, settling into the space with a quiet finality that changed the posture of everyone within earshot. And Officer Daniel Brooks felt it immediately, not as a sound, but as a shift in the ground beneath the moment he thought he understood, his eyes still fixed on the badge for a fraction longer than necessary before lifting back to Marcus Carter's face, searching for something to hold on to, some sign that this could still be redirected, still be managed. But there was nothing there except calm certainty, the kind that does not argue because it does not need to. And Brooks swallowed subtly, adjusting his stance again. But this time the movement felt less like control and more like recalibration. as if the role he had been playing no longer fit the situation unfolding in front of him. And for the first time since the encounter began, his voice did not come out immediately, the words delayed by a hesitation that had not existed before, while the crowd, sensing the shift, leaned further into their silence, no longer uncertain observers, but witnesses to something that had crossed an invisible line. And Elijah Carter, standing just a few feet away, remained unchanged, his presence steady, his expression composed, but there was a quiet acknowledgement in his eyes now as he looked at Marcus, not surprise, not relief, but recognition of something that had always been certain, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. And Marcus lowered his badge slowly, returning it to his jacket with the same deliberate calm, his gaze never leaving Brooks as he spoke again, his tone still even, but now carrying a sharper clarity. "I am going to ask you one more time," he said, not raising his voice, not stepping closer, yet somehow narrowing the space between them all the same. What exactly justified what just happened here? And the question did not invite deflection, it did not leave room for vague answers or procedural language. It demanded truth, simple and direct, and Brooks felt that pressure settle in, not from volume or threat, but from the absence of escape, because the usual responses, the rehearsed explanations, the authority he relied on, none of it aligned with what had just been seen, what had been recorded, what now stood in front of him with quiet, undeniable presence. And he glanced again toward the crowd, noticing the phone still raised, the unwavering attention, the complete lack of support from the environment he had once controlled. And when he looked back at Marcus, his expression had shifted, not entirely, not fully, but enough to reveal the first cracks in the certainty he had carried, and his voice, when it finally came, was lower, more measured, explaining again that he was handling a situation, that he believed the man was causing concern, that he acted within his judgment. But even as he spoke, the words felt thinner, less anchored, as if they were being tested the moment they left his mouth. And Marcus listened, his face unreadable, absorbing the explanation without interruption, without reaction. And when Brooks finished, the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was decisive, because what had been said had not changed what had been seen. And Marcus took a slow breath, his gaze steady, before speaking again, each word placed with precision. "Your judgment is not a shield," he said calmly. "And your authority is not permission to diminish someone's dignity." And the sentence did not rise, did not strike, but it landed with a weight that could not be ignored, and Brooks felt it, the difference between authority and accountability becoming clear in a way it had not been before. And for a moment, he had nothing to respond with, no immediate defense, no quick redirection, just the realization that the moment had moved beyond him entirely. And behind Marcus, the door of the SUV opened again, another figure stepping out, then another, each one moving with the same quiet precision, their presence adding to the shift already in motion, not chaotic, not aggressive, just structured, controlled, reinforcing what was already understood. And the crowd reacted subtly, stepping back slightly, creating space without being asked, their attention now fixed not just on Brooks, but on the unfolding reality of the situation. And Elijah watched it all without moving, his hands still at his sides, his posture unchanged, but his eyes steady, reflecting a quiet truth that had been present from the beginning, that this moment was never about control, it was about consequence. And Brooks, standing there in the heat that now felt heavier than before, finally understood that what had started as something small, something he believed he could manage, had become something far larger, something that would not be dismissed, would not be forgotten. And as Marcus took a slight step to the side, opening the space just enough to reveal the full scene, his voice came once more, calm, unwavering. "We are going to make sure this is addressed properly." And there was no anger in it, no raised tone, just certainty, the kind that does not need to promise anything because it already knows what will follow. And in that moment, Brooks realized that the story he thought he controlled had already been rewritten, and this time, he was no longer the one deciding how it ended. The words did not rush, they settled into the moment with a finality that did not need to be repeated. And as Marcus Carter's voice faded into the heat of the afternoon, the structure of the scene shifted again, not through force, not through urgency, but through quiet alignment, the kind that happens when truth becomes visible and cannot be ignored. And Officer Daniel Brooks felt that shift in a way he could not dismiss. His stance no longer firm but adjusted, his shoulders slightly less rigid. His gaze no longer fixed but moving, searching for something to regain footing, yet finding nothing that responded the way it had before, because the presence around him had changed, the balance had changed, and with it, the certainty he had relied on began to dissolve, slowly but unmistakably, while the additional agents who had stepped out from the SUV positioned themselves with calm precision, not surrounding, not confronting, but present, their stillness reinforcing something far stronger than movement ever could. And the crowd, now fully aware that this was no longer a casual interaction, shifted further back, creating space without being told, their attention sharpened into silence, the kind that listens, the kind that remembers. And in the center of it all, Elijah Carter remained exactly where he had been, his clothes still marked by the earlier moment, but his posture unchanged, grounded, composed, as if nothing essential about him had been altered, as if dignity was not something that could be taken but something that remained regardless of circumstance. And Marcus turned his head slightly toward Elijah, his expression softening just enough to acknowledge him, not with words, but with recognition, with respect, with a quiet understanding that did not need to be explained. And Elijah met that look with the same calm steadiness, a subtle nod passing between them, not signaling resolution, but confirming something deeper, something that had always been true. And when Marcus faced forward again, his attention returned fully to Brooks, his presence steady, his tone unchanged as he spoke once more. "There are procedures for addressing concerns," he said, each word measured, clear, and none of them involve public humiliation. And the statement did not accuse, did not escalate. It clarified, it defined, it drew a line that could no longer be blurred by interpretation. And Brooks, standing within that clarity, felt the narrowing of options, the absence of justification, the reality of accountability settling into place in a way that could not be undone. And his response, when it came, was quieter than before, less certain, the words forming slower, as if each one had to pass through a layer of reconsideration before being spoken. And he nodded once, a small movement, almost involuntary, acknowledging not agreement, but understanding that the situation had moved beyond his control, beyond his authority, beyond the version of events he had attempted to maintain. And that realization did not arrive loudly. It arrived quietly, like the slow shift of something internal that cannot be reversed once it is recognized. And Marcus observed that change without reacting to it, not pressing further, not escalating, simply allowing it to exist, because the moment no longer required force, it required acknowledgement. And behind them, one of the agents stepped forward slightly, speaking into a small device at his collar, his voice low and controlled, relaying information with the same calm precision that defined everything about their presence. And the structure of the situation continued to organize itself, not chaotically, not emotionally, but methodically, as if each step had already been anticipated, already understood. And Brooks glanced once more at Elijah, his eyes lingering there for a second longer than before. And in that glance, something shifted again, not fully, not completely, but enough to reveal a recognition that had not been there earlier, the recognition that the man he had dismissed, the man he had reduced to an assumption, was not what he had believed, and never had been. And Elijah held that gaze without challenge, without judgment, just steady, just present, allowing the realization to settle on its own, without interference, without demand. And in that silence, something deeper than authority moved through the space, something that did not belong to any badge, any title, any uniform, but to something far more enduring. And Marcus took a final step back, not retreating, but repositioning, opening the space again as he spoke with quiet certainty. "This will be documented and reviewed." And the words did not threaten, did not promise. They simply stated what would happen, because what had occurred could no longer remain unseen. And as the moment continued to unfold, no longer driven by conflict but by consequence, Brooks stood there in the heat that had not changed, yet felt entirely different, aware now that the moment he thought would pass unnoticed had become something else entirely, something that would follow him far beyond this street, far beyond this day. And in the stillness that followed, it became clear to everyone watching that what had just happened was not just an encounter. It was a turning point, quiet, precise, and impossible to ignore. The air no longer carried uncertainty. It carried direction, a quiet but undeniable sense that everything unfolding had already crossed the point where it could be dismissed or ignored. And as Marcus Carter stepped slightly to the side, giving space for the process to continue without obstruction, the agents behind him moved with calm efficiency, not rushing, not creating a scene, but beginning to establish order in a way that contrasted sharply with how the moment had started, and that contrast did not go unnoticed, not by the crowd, not by Officer Daniel Brooks, and certainly not by Elijah Carter, who remained where he stood, his presence unchanged, as if the shift around him was simply catching up to something he had known from the beginning. And Brooks, now standing within a situation that no longer responded to his authority, felt the weight of that realization settle deeper, not as a sudden impact, but as a gradual understanding that left no room for denial. And he adjusted his stance once more, but this time there was no attempt to reclaim control, no effort to assert dominance, just a quiet stillness that came from recognizing that the moment had moved beyond him. And one of the agents approached him with a calm, professional tone, speaking clearly but without aggression, requesting information, confirming identity, outlining the next steps in a way that was structured, precise, and impossible to misinterpret. And Brooks responded, his voice steady but noticeably more restrained than before, answering the questions with the same formality he had once used to command the situation, now redirected toward cooperating within it. And the shift in tone, in posture, in presence, was subtle but unmistakable, the difference between control and accountability made visible in real time. While the crowd continued to watch, their silence no longer passive but attentive, absorbing every detail, every word, every shift in dynamic. Because what they were witnessing was not just a continuation of what had happened, it was a transformation of it, a redefinition of who held authority and how it was exercised. And Elijah, standing at the center of it all, finally moved, not away, not in retreat, but simply adjusting his position slightly, the fabric of his shirt now fully dry under the sun, the marks of the earlier moment still visible but no longer defining. And his eyes moved briefly across the scene, taking in the agents, the crowd, the officer, and then returning to Marcus. And in that look, there was no need for words, just a shared understanding that the moment had reached its turning point, that what needed to be seen had been seen, and what needed to follow would follow without resistance. And Marcus nodded once, almost imperceptibly, acknowledging that silent exchange before turning his attention back to the process unfolding, his role not to dominate it, not to control it, but to ensure it remained aligned with something greater than any individual action. And as the agents continued their work, documenting, observing, maintaining structure, the energy of the scene shifted further, the tension dissolving not into relief, but into clarity, the kind that leaves no confusion about what has happened or what it means. And Brooks, now standing within that clarity, allowed his gaze to lower briefly, not in defeat, but in recognition that the moment he had created had not disappeared, had not been forgotten, but had been understood in a way that would carry forward, beyond this street, beyond this day. And when he looked up again, his eyes met Elijah's once more, and this time there was no assumption, no dismissal, just a quiet acknowledgement of something he had failed to see before, something that could not be undone, only recognized. And Elijah held that gaze calmly, offering nothing more, nothing less, just presence, just dignity, the kind that does not need validation to exist. And as the final details of the moment settled into place, as the agents concluded their initial actions and the structure of the situation became fully established, the crowd began to shift, not dispersing quickly, but slowly, thoughtfully, as if each person carried away more than just what they had seen, as if they understood that this was not just an isolated moment, but a reflection of something larger, something that mattered beyond the surface. And Marcus, standing quietly at the edge of it all, watched as the scene began to release its tension, his expression unchanged, his presence still, knowing that what had needed to happen had already begun, and that the rest would unfold not through force, but through truth, through process, through the kind of accountability that does not announce itself loudly, but leaves a lasting impact all the same. And in the quiet that followed, one thing was clear: the moment that had started with assumption had ended with understanding, and nothing about it would be forgotten. The street did not return to what it was, not immediately, not completely, because something had shifted beneath the surface in a way that could not be reversed, and as the last of the structured movement settled into place, as the agents stepped back into quiet formation and the flow of traffic resumed its steady rhythm, the moment lingered, not as noise, not as chaos, but as something heavier, something remembered. And Elijah Carter stood there for a few seconds longer, not because he needed to, but because he understood the weight of what had just passed, the kind of understanding that does not rush to leave, does not seek escape, but acknowledges, fully, completely, before moving forward. And when he finally turned, it was not with haste, not with relief, just with quiet intention, taking a step toward Marcus Carter, his son, the connection between them no longer hidden, no longer implied, but clear in a way that needed no explanation. And for a brief moment, they stood side by side, not speaking, not embracing, just present, their shared silence carrying more meaning than any words could have. And Marcus glanced at his father, his expression softening again, not into emotion that needed to be displayed, but into respect, into recognition, into something grounded and steady. And Elijah returned that look with the same calm dignity he had carried from the beginning, as if nothing about him had changed, because in truth, nothing had. And after a moment, Marcus spoke quietly, his voice lower now, meant only for Elijah, asking if he was all right. And Elijah nodded once, a small, certain movement, answering without elaboration, because he did not need to explain what he had endured, what he had felt, what he had understood. It was already known, already seen, already acknowledged, and Marcus accepted that without pressing further, because he understood that some moments are not meant to be revisited. They are meant to be honored by how they are carried forward. And behind them, Officer Daniel Brooks remained where he stood, no longer at the center of attention, no longer defining the moment, but still within it, still part of its outcome. And as he watched the interaction between father and son, something settled within him, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, the realization that what had unfolded was not just a professional consequence. It was a personal one, a moment that reflected something deeper than a single decision, something that could not be undone by explanation or justification, only recognized, only learned from. And as one of the agents approached him again, calmly guiding him through the next steps with the same measured tone as before, Brooks nodded, this time without hesitation, not because he had been forced, but because he understood that resistance no longer had a place here. And that understanding did not erase what had happened, but it marked the beginning of something else. Something quieter, something that would follow him long after this street returned to normal. And the crowd, now beginning to disperse more fully, carried the moment with them, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way people carry things that matter, in memory, in conversation, in the quiet recognition of having witnessed something real, something that revealed more than it appeared to on the surface. And as Elijah and Marcus began to walk away, together, their pace unhurried, their presence steady, the scene behind them continued to settle, the tension replaced not by relief, but by clarity, the kind that does not fade easily, and the sunlight, still strong, still unchanging, cast long shadows across the pavement, stretching out behind them as they moved forward, leaving the place where the moment had begun, but not leaving the meaning of it behind, because that meaning did not belong to the street, it belonged to what had been revealed, to what had been understood, to what had been corrected without noise, without force, without spectacle. And as they reached the edge of the block, Marcus paused briefly, glancing back once, not at Brooks, not at the crowd, but at the space itself, as if acknowledging that something important had happened there, something that would not be forgotten. And then he turned forward again, continuing on beside his father, their steps aligned, their silence shared, and behind them, the lesson remained, quiet but unmistakable, that authority without respect is empty, and dignity, once revealed, cannot be diminished, because the moment he thought he held the power was the moment he proved he never truly understood it.